The elevator doors slid open onto the 45th floor, and I stepped into the familiar hum of Kestrel Holdings. Even on a gray Thursday morning, the floor-to-ceiling windows caught what little light there was and bounced it across polished wood and glass. I'd been in this office for years, but the air still carried that blend of ambition and tension that made your shoulders stiff without realizing it. I arrived early, as I always did before a major meeting. Today's was one of the most important of the quarter, a seafood export contract that would secure a long-term partnership and set the tone for the rest of the year. My laptop was already out, the slides loaded. I was halfway through aligning the charts on the big screen when one of the junior analysts, Taylor, poked her head in. "You always triple-check, Arlena. You don't trust anyone?" she teased, holding a stack of printed agendas. I smiled faintly. Trust is earned. Numbers are checked. "That's how we keep the lights on." She laughed and disappeared toward the reception area. I went back to scanning the deck. Everything had to be airtight, especially with Lunara's fingerprints on the final draft. She had a knack for sweeping in at the last minute with small improvements that tended to unravel into costly disasters. Right on cue, Lunara breezed in 10 minutes late, wearing a tailored suit the color of champagne and heels sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't look at me as she set her designer bag down, just opened her tablet and started tapping like the room belonged to her. "Morning," I said. She replied without glancing up. When the file sync notification popped up on my screen, my stomach tightened. I opened the version she'd just sent and scrolled. Slide 17 stopped me cold. The line item for the primary shipment cost now read $3,000. It should have been $300,000, a single misplaced decimal point, but in this business, it could bankrupt a smaller client or tank a negotiation before the ink dried. I looked up. Lunara was smoothing her hair in the reflection of the blank screen at the far end of the room. I didn't ask permission. I corrected the figure in my copy and replaced the version in the projector queue. Minutes later, our father, Corvin, walked in with the clients. His presence always seemed to pull the oxygen out of the air, authoritative, calculated. He shook hands, offered that restrained smile he reserved for business, and gestured toward the seats. The presentation began smoothly until the corrected slide appeared. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lunara's posture stiffen. She leaned toward me, her voice ablaze under the polite murmur of the room. "What did you just do?" "Saved you from a lawsuit," I said evenly, keeping my eyes on the clients. Her jaw tightened. Corvin's gaze flicked from the screen to me and back again. No words, just that flicker of irritation he never bothered to hide. Warren Buffett once said it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. That line was running through my mind as I wrapped up the segment. We closed the meeting with handshakes and polite farewells. The client seemed satisfied, unaware of the quiet battle that had just played out at the table. 15 minutes later, I stepped into the hallway. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Greg, one of the mid-level managers who had always been friendly, almost loyal. Dad said, "Protect Lunara no matter what. Arlena's too rigid. Don't let her mess this up. It was meant for someone else." I stopped walking. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the open floor behind me, a blur of hushed conversations. My fingers tightened around the phone. This wasn't just favoritism, it was policy. Greg must have realized his mistake, because another text followed. I sent that to the wrong thread. I didn't respond. Later, as I passed him near the break area, he avoided my eyes. They've been circling the wagons around her for years, I thought, slipping the phone back into my pocket. I just never had proof. Back in the conference room, I kept my face neutral, but I watched them. Lunara leaning toward Corvin, their heads almost touching, small glances exchanged like a language I wasn't supposed to understand. They were anticipating my moves, treating me not as part of the team, but as a threat to be managed. An old saying my mother used to quote floated into my head. "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." I resolved not to be fooled again. As the clients left, their voices echoing faintly down the hall, Corvin stepped close enough that only I could hear him. "We'll talk about this later," he murmured. The way he said later felt less like a meeting and more like a summons to judgment. Corvin's voice cut through the hallway before I even saw him. "Arlena, my office, now." There was no need for him to raise his tone. The clipped precision in those 3 words was enough to signal this wasn't a conversation I could sidestep. I followed him into his office, noting the deliberate absence of Lunara. The blinds were drawn, muting the view of Elliott Bay. He closed the door with a finality that seemed to lock the air inside. "You don't correct family in public," he began, each syllable measured. "You protect them." I met his eyes. Protecting family doesn't mean letting them burn the house down. That error would have cost us everything in the room. His expression didn't change. "It wasn't your decision to make. You undermined your sister in front of clients. That reflects on all of us." The absurdity of it was almost laughable. Almost. In family businesses, merit doesn't always outrank blood, I get that. But this isn't a holiday dinner. It's a contract worth millions. His gaze sharpened. "It's about unity, Arlena. And you made us look divided." He turned to his desk, as if the matter were settled. The meeting was over. When I stepped back into the corridor, the hum of conversation from earlier had thinned. People were at their desks, eyes fixed on screens. I passed Jenna, someone who had always stopped to chat. Today, she glanced away, suddenly fascinated by a stack of files. I slowed. "Jenna?" She hesitated, then walked with me toward the break room, keeping her voice low. "They're saying you're trouble. Management told us it's best to keep our distance." "Best for who?" She looked down at her hands. "I'm sorry. I have kids to think about." And just like that, she was gone, leaving the faint smell of coffee and a heavier silence than before. Walking back toward my desk, I took in the small but telling changes. Conversations that stopped when I walked by. The quick minimization of chat windows. Even Greg, the same Greg who had accidentally sent me that text, gave a curt nod and kept moving. When fear becomes currency, loyalty goes bankrupt. This wasn't the result of one meeting. The speed of the shift told me it had been in motion for a while. My correction earlier was just the excuse they'd been waiting for. I sat at my desk and began mentally mapping the landscape. Who still talked to me? Who didn't? It was like watching a chessboard where pieces had quietly moved overnight. An American saying came to mind: "If you're not at the table, you're on the menu." The pattern was clear. I wasn't just being sidelined, I was being set up to fail. I powered on my laptop to focus on some actual work, but an email notification popped up immediately. The subject line was short, almost sterile. Private executive discussion. Mandatory attendance. The meeting was in 30 minutes. I stared at the screen. This wasn't a conversation, it was a summons. And something in my gut told me it was the first move in a trap I didn't see coming. The invite had landed in my inbox like a stone. No greeting, no explanation, just a subject line. Private executive discussion. Mandatory attendance. I'd seen enough maneuvering in this company to know it wasn't going to be a collaborative brainstorming session. Still, 30 minutes later, I walked toward the executive boardroom, heels clicking on the marble floor, the scent of polished wood and faint cologne drifting from the corridor ahead. 2 security guards stood at the double glass doors. That was unusual. In my years here, I'd never seen them stationed outside a meeting like this. One of them stepped forward. "This is a private family session, ma'am." I looked from his face to the frosted glass panel behind him. "I am family." His jaw tightened. "Only select members are allowed." There it was. The line in the sand, drawn by someone who had decided I wasn't select enough. The email wasn't an invitation. It was bait, designed to ensure I was standing here, in plain sight, while they decided my fate inside. Exclusion, I thought, is the first stage of elimination. I didn't argue. Arguing here would have been like pounding on a locked door just to give the people inside a reason to label me emotional. So I stayed, leaning casually against the wall, hands folded. For the next 20 minutes, muffled voices leaked through the glass. Lunara's sharper tones rose now and then, like a blade scraping over stone. My father's voice was lower, steady, authoritative, cutting through without raising volume. Every so often, the guards exchanged glances, like they were listening too. A junior staffer, carrying a stack of folders, rounded the corner. She caught sight of me and immediately dropped her gaze to the carpet, speeding past. That avoidance told me more than any overheard sentence could. They wanted my isolation to be visible, to send a message. When the door finally opened, it wasn't for me. People filtered out in pairs, some making a point to nod politely, others pretending they didn't notice me at all. Lunara emerged last, her lips curling in a faint smile, too slight to be called a smirk, but deliberate enough to feel like one. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. By the time afternoon rolled around, the pre-scheduled family luncheon loomed like an obligation I couldn't dodge. The dining hall was buzzing when I walked in, cousins, uncles, and a few extended relatives who also held minor roles in the business. Silver chafing dishes lined one wall, the scent of roasted chicken and garlic bread wafting through the air. I had just filled a glass of water when my father's voice cut across the room. He was standing at the far end, speaking to a small cluster of relatives, but pitched his tone to Carrie. "We gave Arlena a position so she wouldn't drift aimlessly," he said, pausing to take a sip of wine. "And look where we are now." It was measured, practiced, the kind of remark that could be brushed off as just an observation if challenged. But the implication landed like a punch. Chairs scraped softly as people shifted. A few cousins glanced at me with awkward sympathy. Others kept their eyes locked on their plates, as if eating faster could make them invisible. When someone rewrites your worth out loud, they're testing how much you'll tolerate. I set my glass down, steadying my voice. "If you think I'll stand here and let you narrate my life," I said, clearly enough for every ear in the room, "you're wrong." His eyebrow lifted. Barely. But I knew that look. It was the same one he'd given me as a child when I defied him, the one that dared me to take the next step. And this time, I intended to. Mid-afternoon light slanted through the blinds in Corvin's office, cutting across the desk like a grid. He didn't invite me to sit. I stayed standing, the weight of the luncheon still hanging in my chest. "This won't take long," he said, flipping a folder closed with deliberate care. "Your position is terminated, effective immediately." It was the way he said it, like he was announcing a change in the weather. Nothing personal, nothing worth discussion. I kept my voice steady. "So you're cutting me out of my work and my home in the same breath?" He leaned back, folding his hands. "The apartment is corporate property. You have 1 week to vacate. You'll land on your feet somewhere else. Just not here." There was a cold satisfaction in his eyes, the kind that told me this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. He'd been waiting for the right moment to deliver it. I thought of an old HR truth I'd heard from a mentor years ago. When they want you gone, they take your desk and your address in one sweep. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an argument. I just turned and walked out, the click of my heels sharper than usual against the marble floor. Back at my office, I opened my bottom drawer to start packing, but stopped. A uniformed security guard stood in the doorway. "Ms. Voss?" he said with the kind of politeness that's really just armor. "I've been instructed to stay until you're finished. You're not permitted to remove any files, physical or digital. That includes personal documents." I straightened. "Even personal ones?" "Those are the instructions." "I'm just making a note," I replied, pulling out my phone, "of every face in this hallway." He didn't flinch. "I'm just doing my job." "Me too," I said, even though my job had just been erased. The rest of my packing was a strange pantomime, taking home plants, photos, and a few books while leaving behind the things that mattered. The guard followed me to the elevator, silent but present, like a shadow. I drove straight to the apartment. The doorman avoided my eyes, murmuring a polite greeting, but it was the subtle shift in his tone that told me word had already reached this building. Inside, I went to my filing cabinets. The keys didn't work. They'd changed the locks. Not just the office, but here too. Files I'd kept for years, contracts, client notes, even some of my own personal records, were now sealed away. It wasn't just removal, it was erasure. I walked the apartment slowly, as if cataloging what was mine and what had always belonged to them. The place felt different already, like I was just a guest passing through. I pulled out my phone again and began photographing the cabinets, the desk, the storage closets, everything I couldn't access. A paper trail of a different kind. In my head, I started mapping allies. Who might still take my call? Who would quietly slip me a copy of a document if I asked? Who would keep their distance, even if they didn't want to? Sometimes the door that closes is the one they locked to keep you from seeing their mess. By the time I walked out, the guard from the office was stationed in the lobby, as if my life now required a chaperone. I stepped into the late afternoon air, the sky heavy with clouds. They'd boxed me out of everything but my mind, and that was where the real fight would start. The apartment looked like a half-finished puzzle by the time the sun dipped below the skyline. Boxes lined the hallway in uneven stacks, some sealed, others open with clothes and books spilling over the edges. I moved slowly through the rooms, deciding what went into storage, what I could take with me, and what I would leave behind for good. I was kneeling by my desk, pulling out old notepads and envelopes, when my hand caught the corner of a drawer I'd assumed was empty. It didn't open easily, probably swollen wood from years of neglect, but when it finally gave, the faint smell of paper and dust filled the air. Inside was a neat stack of file folders. Some were stamped with dates from years ago, others with internal memos signed in my father's sharp, deliberate handwriting. As I flipped one open, I felt my shoulders tense. These weren't just routine records. They were problem files, budget overruns signed off without explanation, contract revisions that shifted liability away from clients but mysteriously benefited Lunara's department, and email printouts that made the mistakes sound intentional. One project in particular caught my eye. It was from 4 years ago, a partnership that had fallen apart under vague circumstances. Here, in black and white, was the real story: a missed shipment, penalties absorbed by the client, and Lunara's name on the approval line. My father's note at the bottom read, "Handled internally. No further discussion. The past is never buried, it's just misfiled." And now I had proof that the pedestal she stood on had been built from other people's losses. I carried the stack to the coffee table and began laying them out by year. Each file told its own story, but together they formed a pattern: mismanagement, concealment, and protection at the expense of the truth. I traced my finger along one column of figures, recognizing the name of a client who had walked away abruptly. Another file showed a project I'd been told was shelved due to market conditions. In reality, it had been over budget by nearly $500,000 before being quietly buried. Every number here told a story, and none of them were the version they'd told the world. I leaned back, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the apartment. The boxes around me suddenly seemed less important. This wasn't just leverage, it was a map of the rot that had been eating away at Kestrel Holdings long before they decided I was expendable. The lock on my door clicked, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was just me. Habit made me double-check when I came and went now. I gathered the papers into a single pile, bound them with a rubber band, and slid them under the couch cushion. I was about to call it a night when my phone rang. Cassian Dorrell's name lit the screen. We hadn't spoken directly since before my firing, though I'd seen his name float around enough contracts to know he was still one of the company's biggest clients. "Cassian," I answered. He didn't waste time. "I heard what happened." His voice was calm, steady, like a man who dealt in certainties. "If you're ever on your own, call me. Some of us prefer working with people who don't need cover-ups to stay in business." I blinked, caught between surprise and something dangerously close to relief. "That's a generous thing to say." "It's not generosity," he said. "It's trust, and you've earned it. Just remember, you can't buy that. You can't buy trust. You can only earn it." My father had spent years buying loyalty with power, and Lunara had coasted on the same currency. Cassian's words reminded me that there was another way, one they'd never been able to understand. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I'll keep that in mind." After the call ended, I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the pile of evidence under the couch. Around me, half-packed boxes waited like obedient soldiers, but now they felt like a distraction. Maybe I'd been packing the wrong things. The morning air near Pike Place Market carried a damp chill, the kind that seeps into your sleeves even when the sun is trying to break through the clouds. I arrived at the coffee shop earlier than planned, choosing a corner table that gave me a clear view of the entrance. Years in negotiations had made it second nature to never sit with my back to the door. Today's meeting was framed as a goodbye. At least, that was the official reason I'd given when I reached out. What I really wanted was to keep the thread intact, make sure the line between us stayed warm, even if dormant. When Victor stepped inside, his eyes darted around before settling on me. There was a stiffness to his shoulders, but by the time he reached my table, his expression softened into something more familiar. "Arlena," he said, sliding into the seat opposite. "I wasn't sure if you'd still want to talk." I smiled faintly. "If our paths cross again, I hope it's under terms we both choose." He let out a small chuckle. "You were the reason we stayed with Kestrel all these years. The contracts were fine, but you knew our business." We traded stories, revisiting the frantic weeks before a major launch, the late-night calls to avert disasters. Slowly, the guardedness in his tone faded. Before we parted, I didn't make a pitch or a promise, just left the space open. Every goodbye is an interview for your next hello. After Victor left, I lingered over my coffee, watching the ebb and flow of people through the market street. Then my phone buzzed with a message from another contact, a casual invite to drop by their office if I had time. I had time. By late morning, I was sitting across from Dana in a smaller, quieter cafe a few blocks from the water. She ran operations for one of our biggest accounts. The conversation flowed easily until she mentioned, almost in passing, a recent contract change. "Legal said it was standard," she said, stirring her tea. "But it didn't feel standard. It cuts our dispute window in half." I didn't let my surprise show. "When did this happen?" "Last week. Lunara signed off personally." I leaned back, letting her words sink in. She wasn't just careless, she was building a trap she couldn't see past. Shortening a dispute window wasn't just inconvenient, it was a power move that stripped the client of leverage. I'd seen the same tactic buried in some of the documents I found back at the apartment. Dana sighed. "We signed it because we trusted the name, not the paper. Now I'm not so sure." I didn't push. Instead, I tucked the information away, another bead on the string I was slowly threading together. The rest of the day was a blur of quiet movement. 2 more meetings, each framed as a farewell. I told stories, listened more than I spoke, and left with no promises exchanged, only an unspoken understanding. A handshake, a nod, and the knowledge that they knew where to find me if they needed change. Each conversation felt like placing another piece on a chessboard only I could see. You don't have to chase the ball if you know where it's going to land. By the time evening settled in, I was back at my apartment, the streetlights casting pale amber shapes across the living room. I pulled out my notebook and started jotting down the details. Who seemed uneasy? Who hinted at dissatisfaction? Who might be the first to call? Flipping through the notes, the pattern of Lunara's overreach was emerging more clearly. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was slow sabotage, and if I was patient enough, I wouldn't have to lift a finger to expose it. She was already setting the stage. Late morning sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the shared workspace in Pioneer Square, catching dust motes in its path. I'd been half focused on a spreadsheet when an email pinged into my inbox. Anonymous sender, no subject. Normally, I'd delete something like that without a second thought. But the preview line showed figures and project codes that only someone inside Kestrel would know. I opened it. The attachment was a set of spreadsheets, each accompanied by scanned memos. At first glance, they looked like routine budget reports, but the deeper I read, the tighter my jaw set. Lunara had signed off on a budget shift that gutted funding for one of the company's highest-profile projects. The reallocation didn't make strategic sense. It left the project unable to meet delivery standards. In plain terms, it was a slow-motion train wreck. She's betting the house on a hand she doesn't even understand, I thought, sliding the papers into a fresh folder. Whoever sent this wanted me to know she was setting herself, and Kestrel, up for a major client loss. I debated for a long minute whether to act now or let the rope play out. If I went public, it would cause chaos. But if I waited, it could cost her far more. I printed the documents, tucked them into my secure file case, and locked it. Some things were worth holding until the exact right moment. By early afternoon, I'd barely made it through 2 follow-up calls when my phone rang again. The number was from a contact at another firm, someone I'd always trusted to tell me the truth. "Off the record," he began without preamble. "They're making you sound like a thief." I didn't answer right away. "Word's going around you walked out of Kestrel with client databases," he continued. "Names, renewal dates, private contact info, the works." I closed my eyes briefly. It was so predictable it almost bored me. "When they can't beat your work," I said, "they'll attack your name." "It's working on some people," he warned. "I've already heard 2 execs say they might hold off reaching out to you." I thanked him for calling and hung up, but within an hour, I could see the shift myself. Emails from contacts that normally replied in minutes now took hours, if they replied at all. 2 meetings I'd set for next week suddenly needed to be rescheduled. It was a slow bleed, nothing you could point to as one fatal blow, but enough to poison the air. A lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth puts its boots on. And right now, Lunara was working the room barefoot and still ahead. I wasn't going to let it stand. That evening, I called 2 of my most trusted allies in the industry, people with enough reach to counteract the narrative without making it look like I was on defense. I gave them the short, verifiable truth. I had left Kestrel with no client data, had never breached a non-compete, and any client who contacted me did so of their own choice. "I'll make sure the right people know," one of them said. Quietly. The other was more blunt. "You've got enemies with reach, but you've also got friends who don't scare easy." After the calls, I began documenting everything. Screenshots of the rumor, saved voicemails, even timestamps of suspicious, anonymous emails. If this turned into a legal matter, I wanted my case airtight. By the time I closed my laptop, my mind had shifted from defense to positioning. I didn't have to chase Lunara. Her own patterns, careless moves, shady contract changes, and now a massive budget blunder were the kind of traps that didn't need my hand to spring. All I had to do was make sure I was ready when she stumbled. My phone buzzed again. Another anonymous email. No attachments this time, just one line of text. "Watch the gala next week. She's going to hand you the win." I leaned back in my chair, the city lights flickering on outside the window. If that was true, I didn't just need to be ready. I needed to be standing exactly where everyone could see me when it happened. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers, every surface polished to a mirror shine. Glasses clinked, polite laughter floated over the hum of strings from a live quartet. I moved through the crowd as a guest of a supplier, not part of the Kestrel contingent. That was deliberate. I wanted a vantage point, not a spotlight. From my position near the far wall, I watched Lunara glide through the room. Every detail about her tonight was calculated. Hair pinned into a flawless twist, a deep emerald gown that caught the light with each turn, the kind of poised smile that photographs well. She leaned in toward board members, touching elbows, tilting her head just enough to project attentiveness. She was playing the role she'd written for herself years ago. When the MC took the stage to begin the awards portion, the room stilled. "And now, the leader of the year," he announced, pausing for effect, "goes to Lunara Kestrel for her outstanding work on the Coastal Trade Expansion Project." Applause erupted. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. That project had been mine from inception to delivery. Every negotiation, every late-night revision, every crisis averted. I could still picture the spreadsheets spread across my dining table, coffee going cold beside me while I worked out the shipping bottleneck that would have sunk the deal. Lunara walked to the stage, waving in acknowledgement, the picture of gracious achievement. She began her speech with an easy confidence, thanking the board, the executive team, and of course, my incredible staff. No mention of me. It was a surgical omission, cutting me out of the story without drawing blood in public. I inhaled slowly, let the air out in a controlled stream. Sometimes the best mic drop is letting them hand you the rope. She was mid-sentence, detailing the innovative strategies that had supposedly propelled the project forward when a ripple moved through the audience. It began at the back, a few murmurs, people glancing down at their phones, Then it spread in waves, shoulders turning, screens lighting up faces. I caught sight of the man next to me, showing his phone to the woman beside him. She covered her mouth. The video played without sound in my line of sight, but I didn't need audio to know the clip. It had circulated internally months ago, never meant to leave the safety of the boardroom. Then someone near me turned the volume up. Lunara's voice, unmistakable. "Dad will clean it up, like he always does. 3 million or not, no one's firing me." The timing was brutal. She froze on stage, the smile flickering, eyes darting to the side as if someone might hand her a lifeline. A cough from the front row broke the silence, followed by a few uncomfortable laughs. She tried to push through, her words tangling into each other. "Of course, leadership is about accountability and, vision." But the authority was gone. Around me, conversations dropped to low whispers. I felt eyes on me, some curious, some newly aware. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply sipped my drink, holding her gaze when it briefly met mine across the room. "You just lit your own stage on fire." By the time she stepped off the podium, applause was scattered, perfunctory. Her phone buzzed non-stop in her clutch, the glow from the screen leaking through the seams. Mine buzzed too. An unknown number. The message was short. "One down. You're next to move." I slipped the phone back into my bag, the hum of the room settling into the background. The night had shifted, and everyone in that ballroom knew it. The morning after the gala, I arrived at my shared office space before sunrise. The building was quiet, except for the low hum of the heater and the occasional elevator chime. I had barely set my bag down when my phone began vibrating, a steady stream of texts and emails lighting up the screen. Most were from industry contacts, forwarding me links to the leaked video, asking if the rumors were true, or simply sending a short, "Wow, did you see this?" Cassian was the first to call. "They'll start dropping like flies," he said, without even a hello. "Be ready." "I've been ready for years," I answered, pulling up my email. 3 major clients had already sent formal termination notices overnight. No explanations, just clean clinical language citing contract conclusion. It was the kind of phrasing that meant, "We're out, but we're not interested in a fight." By mid-morning, the pace picked up. 15 contracts were gone in a single hour. Some clients were blunt in their calls. "This isn't about price or service. We just can't work with leadership we don't trust." Others were polite, almost apologetic. "You know I respect you, Arlena, but I can't ignore what's out there." I kept my responses short and professional. "I understand. Thank you for letting me know." But inside, every confirmation felt like another weight lifting from my shoulders. They weren't just leaving Kestrel, they were walking toward me. One client, a longtime partner I hadn't spoken to in months, said it outright. "We followed you before without even realizing it. Now we're doing it on purpose." By lunch, I had a private spreadsheet open, tracking the names and timelines. The number kept ticking upward. The same people who had avoided me in the hallways of Kestrel were now making quiet, deliberate moves to sever ties with the company entirely. Around 3 o'clock, my attorney called. "I've reviewed everything," she said. "These clients are acting independently. You haven't violated your non-compete in any way. If Kestrel tries to challenge this, they'll lose." By the end of the day, the total was 98. 98 clients, representing nearly 40% of Kestrel's revenue, gone in less than 24 hours. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of that number settle. Sometimes you win by standing still while the other side burns their own bridges. The office had grown dim. Outside, the sky over Seattle was streaked with orange and gray. I shut down my laptop, ready to head home, when my phone lit up again. The caller ID made me pause. My father's name. I let it ring twice before answering. "You did this," he said, his voice tight and low. I didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us like a wire pulled taut. I sat in the darkened living room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, when the phone lit up again. My father's name glared from the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "You did this," he said. No greeting, no hesitation. His voice was tight, clipped, like he'd been holding the words back all day. "You humiliated this family." I leaned back into the couch, letting him push air into the silence. He continued, a relentless stream, clients lost, revenue vanishing, whispers in the industry. You think you've won something here, Arlena. You've burned your name into this mess forever. I let him talk until the edge in his tone dulled. You can't fight a storm by shouting at the rain. When he finally paused, I said evenly, if you want to discuss this, we should do it in person, tomorrow, somewhere neutral. The next morning, the conference room at the downtown legal office was cold enough to make the glass of water in front of me sweat. My father sat across the polished table, one of Kestrel's corporate attorneys on his right, flipping through a thick binder. His cufflinks caught the light every time he moved his hands. You've breached your non-compete, my father began, his eyes fixed on me. You orchestrated a mass client departure. Our legal team will make sure you pay for that. I didn't argue. I simply reached into my briefcase and slid a slim folder across the table. Read Clause 14. The lawyer frowned, adjusted his glasses, and flipped to the marked page. His lips moved as he read. In the event that the designated account manager is changed without client consent, said client retains the right to terminate or transfer their account without penalty. I met my father's gaze. You triggered this the moment you replaced me without their agreement. They walked on their own. The lawyer cleared his throat. This is binding. For the first time in years, I saw my father's composure shift. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tightening around the armrest, as the lawyer quietly explained the legal reality, that there was no breach, no case to pursue. I didn't smile, but I didn't look away either. The power is in the fine print, not the headlines. When the meeting ended, I gathered my things, the sound of my briefcase clasp clicking shut, echoing in the quiet room. As I reached the door, my father's voice followed me. You've burned every bridge, he muttered, low but sharp. I paused, hand on the handle. Maybe, I said, turning my head just enough to meet his eyes. Or maybe I just stopped letting you walk across mine. 3 days after our confrontation in the legal office, the news broke. I was in my shared workspace, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm while I cleared emails, when a headline popped up on my screen. Kestrel Holdings Board votes to remove CEO Corvin Kestrel and Executive VP Lunara Kestrel. I opened the article. It was short, factual, and merciless. Nearly half of Kestrel's revenue had evaporated since the gala. Investors were restless, clients openly defecting. The board had voted, unanimously. A second notification chimed. This one had photos. Corvin, jaw set, stepping out of the headquarters in a charcoal suit, refusing to acknowledge the cameras. Lunara behind him, sunglasses on though the sky was overcast, her hand gripping the strap of her purse like it might anchor her to something solid. I didn't feel glee. I didn't even smile, just a long, slow exhale. The fight was over. The outcome had been inevitable from the moment they mistook family protection for corporate strategy. Every dynasty ends when the numbers no longer add up. Before I could close the article, my phone buzzed. Cassian. You didn't just survive, Arlena, he said without preamble. You rewrote the ending. I leaned back. No, I just stopped letting them write mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind that follows a shared understanding. Later that afternoon, I started getting messages from former colleagues. A few apologized for keeping their distance when things first turned. One wrote, I wish I'd had your backbone. Others were more practical, asking if I was hiring or hinting that they might be available in a few weeks. I answered each one, but never with promises I couldn't keep. I'd learned enough to know that rebuilding needed to be intentional, not reactionary. Toward the end of the week, I found myself walking past Kestrel headquarters. The building looked the same, steel and glass catching the winter light, the logo still gleaming above the revolving doors, but the power inside was gone, shifted, hollowed out. I stood across the street for a moment, watching employees come and go. Some I recognized, most I didn't. I wondered which of them still believed the company could be salvaged and which were already looking for the nearest exit. There's no satisfaction in the fall of a legacy, only the reminder of what it cost everyone involved. You can win the war and still count the graves. I turned to leave, my hands deep in my coat pockets, when my phone buzzed again. No name this time, Just a number I didn't recognize. Lunara wants to see you. I stared at the message, feeling no rush to answer. Whatever she thought she was coming for, I doubted it was something I was willing to give. The late afternoon sun poured through the tall windows of my new office, casting a soft glow over the walnut desk. The space was quiet, insulated from the street noise below. I was reviewing a proposal when the door swung open without a knock. Lunara stood there. No emerald gown this time, no polished armor of confidence. Her hair was pulled back loosely, her blazer creased at the elbows, and she looked smaller. "Arlena," she said, stepping inside. "I need to talk to you." I didn't offer her a seat right away. Instead, I closed the folder in front of me and leaned back, waiting. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the window before settling back on me. "I just need to understand how you built loyalty they can't fire. Clients, staff, people who stick, even when it's messy." I gestured toward the chair. She sat, smoothing her skirt, filling the silence with her own discomfort. "You can't manage loyalty," I said finally. "You have to earn it every day." She nodded quickly, as if agreeing would make me keep talking. "So, can you help me rebuild? Just some guidance? What to do first?" There was a time when that request would have landed like a hook in my chest, tugging at old habits of wanting to fix what was broken, even if it wasn't mine to fix. But that time had passed. "Loyalty isn't built by hiding mistakes and stepping on everyone else," I said. "It's built by protecting the people who trust you, even when it costs you." Her shoulders slumped. "I know I've made mistakes." "You've shown exactly what you'd do with a second chance," I replied, my tone even. "And it's not something I want to be part of." The words hung between us, not cruel, but final. This wasn't revenge. It was a clean cut, the last thread between us as colleagues, as sisters in name only. She looked like she wanted to say more, but instead, she stood. "I see," she murmured, and left without another glance. When the door clicked shut, the office felt lighter. I crossed to the corner where my safe sat, a sturdy steel thing that weighed as much as a small car. Turning the combination, I pulled the door open. Inside was the thick envelope of documents I'd found weeks ago, the paper trail of cover-ups, budget manipulations, and silent protections that had propped up the image of competence for far too long. I held them for a moment, the weight familiar in my hands. They weren't leverage anymore. They were history. A reminder of where I'd been and where I would never return. I slid the envelope to the back of the safe and closed the heavy door. The dial turned with a solid click. Power isn't in what you can destroy. It's in what you choose to protect. When I turned back to my desk, a new contract lay waiting for my signature. A client I'd courted on my own. No boardroom politics, no hidden clauses. The value on the agreement was higher than any single deal I'd ever closed at Kestrel. I picked up the pen. It felt lighter than I expected. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was my life, finally mine to build.